Today at the National Press Club, Chair of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, Kim Williams. After taking on the role in March, today he'll argue investing in the ABC is one of the best defences against mis- and disinformation. Kim Williams with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, where we are meeting on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, Canberra. My name's Laura Tingle. I'm the club's president. I'm also a director of the ABC, as well as 730's chief political correspondent, so I obviously have a particular interest in what our speaker has to say today. But, like all ABC employees, our greater interest and ambition in life is to serve the Australian public across a broad spectrum of services the ABC provides as the public broadcaster. Everyone seems to have a view about the ABC, a position that reflects a rightful sense of ownership over it, for better or worse. Kim Williams was appointed Chair of the ABC earlier this year, and in many speeches and interviews since, has become a very public advocate for the organisation and the roles it plays, should play and could play in Australia's public life, particularly at a time of splintering community consensus and mis- and disinformation. Please welcome him to the podium to address us today.
Thanks, Laura. It's a pleasure to be back at the National Press Club. After an absence of more than a decade, it's welcome to catch up with old friends and colleagues and hopefully to make new ones. I commence by offering acknowledgement to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, the traditional custodians of these ancestral lands, and recognise their enduring connection to the land and waterways around us. I pay respect to elders past and present and to elders of other communities in Australia. Colleagues, as a true believer in Australian creativity, I start with an image from one of our most celebrated works of literature. In George Johnston's masterpiece, My Brother Jack, set in the 1930s, the narrator, a journalist named Davy Meredith, has the task of boarding the great steamships arriving in Melbourne every Monday morning to interview important visitors from Europe to get first-hand accounts of what was going on in the rest of the world 12,000 miles away. This had been a standard Australian news-gathering technique since before the submarine cable and the radio had turned it into an indulgence. Even by the 1930s, the information and views the visitors brought was already weeks old. This news, Johnson writes, rather than being something that was actually happening now, had the quality of the light of a distant star. This scene, taken from Johnson's own experiences as a journalist at the Argus, reminds us there was once a time when the news of the world drifted towards Australia with such tepid velocity that we felt compelled to go out to meet it. Not so now. We are a geographically large country at the bottom of the world whose language is the lingua franca, English. We can receive, read and absorb almost everything instantaneously. This gives us great advantages, but it also leaves us uniquely vulnerable. Where once we couldn't get enough information, and where once that information was mostly factual and reliable, we are being flooded with content, some of it dubious, some of it downright lies. That trickle of information we once rushed out to bring ashore has become a tsunami, breaking through our feeble levees, washing over us, surging through the streets to potentially reshape our mental landscape, especially in the minds of our young. Like all tsunamis, it drags ashore sharp, dangerous objects. Misinformation, false information spread due to ignorance, error or mistake, sometimes without intention to deceive. And disinformation, the deliberate spreading of false information and narratives to achieve malicious intent. The products of Vladimir Putin's bot farms, Andrew Tate's poisonous misogynistic videos, AI tools in the hands of our enemies and criminals, lies intended to spread confusion, exploit vulnerability, sow division, destroy resolve. Australia and similar countries have recently started to realise the profound damage this can cause, especially in an era of increasing global tension and military conflict. As French President Emmanuel Macron remarked earlier this year when speaking of Europe, we are living in an era of cultural clash, driven by digital social networks and the digitisation of society, in which we are losing our capacity to produce our own national narrative, making it impossible to build our own future. In the digital world we all now inhabit, Macron argued, information has become an issue of national sovereignty. Let's be clear. If we do not provide our people with trusted information, we will increasingly tell ourselves stories that are not really about us, but part of an extended global imaginary, our own story disappearing under the waves. It's already happening. That tsunami of overseas generated content breaching our information defences is now competing for the affections, hearts, minds and aspirations of our people. Most dangerously, it is targeting the next generation of Australian children, teenagers and young adults, compromising their confidence about and knowledge of Australian history, Australian stories, Australian accents and Australian values in ways that may harm our future. This is damaging our social cohesion, weakening the links between our regions and cities, generating unnecessary cultural conflict and weakening us. We must counter it. Our first line of defence is to create an environment in which facts from credible sources predominate. Strengthening our nation's news capacity is essential. The ABC's news output is already impressive, with some 16,000 original content news items published monthly and with engagement scores that exceed 660 million minutes on the recently measured, for example, monthly figures in April, with a profusion of audio and video offerings amounting to several thousand a month and with significantly increased reach and engagement. But we must make it even stronger. This will require extra investment, but also a commitment to the most important quality of journalism, objectivity. That's why, since taking the job as chair of the ABC, I have been insisting that all of our journalists adhere, always, to the highest standards of objectivity and professional ethics. We do not serve causes at the ABC, we serve the truth. This is non-negotiable. We will sometimes make mistakes, but when we do, we will acknowledge them, correct them, and redouble our efforts to avoid them in the future, as we have done in recent times. Our processes are and will remain robust and under vigilant editorial review. Our nation more broadly is beginning to focus on the dangers of the information age, examining potential new defences, including a media bargaining code, a digital platform levy, social media restrictions for the young, all of them incredibly tricky and difficult to put in place. However, there is a collective sense that action needs to be taken. As the poisoned waters of the tsunami rise, it's good to get the young, especially, into lifeboats. They are particularly vulnerable to the flood. Their minds are precious assets needed for our future success. But lifeboats are always flimsy protections against surging tides. And one day our young will have to swim for themselves in the poisoned seas. So they and everyone else will need to be better prepared. We must therefore get better at exposing misinformation, correcting disinformation, and arming Australians with the skills needed to counter both. Just as the founding of democracy in the industrial age required an aspiration to universal literacy, its continuation in the digital age requires universal media literacy. These skills will give us strong defences, but defence can only get you so far in the battle against disinformation and misinformation. We can't accept that in the current strange era, increasingly, nothing is more empowering than ignorance. Ignorance is unburdened by knowledge and understanding of and respect for history. Ignorance has no fidelities, no sense of social commitment. Ignorance is in divine indifference to a sense of obligations to others and to the truth. It invariably serves personal whims, too often fed by narcissism and fantasy. This is profoundly dangerous. The best policy is counterattack by generating more of our own news, information, discussion, documentaries, educational, children's drama and other programming, which celebrates and interrogates the rich diversity of our nation and its humanity. Nature, as we know, abhors a vacuum. We need to fill the void before others do. Most of all, we need to help Australians come up with our own homegrown animating idea. Everywhere we look across the world, national stories are being contested, and in places like Ukraine, literally being fought over. What is our national story? It's something that we need to develop together. In a world of increasing hostility, we need a confident sense of who we are, knowledge of the society and political system we want to maintain, a strong grasp of history and science, and an understanding of how our great political, legal and educational institutions work to keep us free. We need to believe in ourselves, express ourselves with confidence, be creative in our response to big problems, have a set of common beliefs that can bind us together as citizens, regardless of where we live, what colour collar we wear to work, what our culture, gender or family origin may be. All the ingredients of what we used to call patriotism. It's an old-fashioned term, but one I personally like. We will find it through news and discussion, but also from documentaries and, on occasion, in great drama. I used to describe this process of finding our nation's true north. But of course, for us, at the bottom of the world, what we need is a true south, an understanding and appreciation of our place in the world, our beliefs and our national interests. To find that true south, we need to invigorate our entire homegrown media industry. Every media company and every journalist represented here at our great National Press Club can be part of this revival. Australia's media companies are not competitors in this task of renewal. We are allies, each approaching it in our own way with our own priorities. But the national task will necessarily fall mostly to the ABC. We must make the ABC into the best public broadcaster it can possibly be, not at some far-off time in the future, but now. It is still a formidable organisation, serving Australians by producing a spectrum of news, documentaries and of children's educational drama and other programming per year in audio, video, broadcast, streaming, on demand and in a myriad of digital iterations across a profusion of platforms. And serving our region through ABC international services with audiences of more than 11 million people a month across our platforms, with more on social, playing a major part in our nation's soft diplomacy. But frankly, the forces against us are considerable and they are often overwhelming. We need stronger Australian responses. Despite all we still do, the ABC is in need of attention and care. Without the ABC, the Australian media would be in a severe situation. When I was younger, a wise old publisher said something that has always stuck with me. There are three kinds of people in the policy and commercial world, Kim, he said. Those who make things happen, those who watch things happen, and those who stand back and say, "What happened?" What happened was this. We stood back for the best part of 3 or 4 decades and allowed the ABC to lose 1/3 of its funding in real terms when its services have been needed more than ever before. In the last decade alone, our operating revenue from government has fallen by 13.7% in real terms, or to put that in a simple number, an annual reduction of $150 million. When public investment in the ABC is discussed, it is often observed that its annual budget is over $1 billion. This is true, and the board takes the responsibility of investing this money wisely very seriously. The fact remains, however, that the budget allocation has not kept pace with rising costs. Funding the ABC represents a tiny proportion of the budget, and it has been getting smaller. In just this century, we have declined from an overall share of Commonwealth outlays of 0.31% in 2000-2001 to 0.13% in today's outlays, a dramatic decline by any measure. Currently, Australia invests around 40% less per person in public broadcasting than the average for a comparable set of 20 OECD democracies. As our nation has become richer, our nation's broadcaster has become much poorer. Moreover, in the 1990s, the ABC operated considerably fewer services, 1 television channel rather than the 4 it has today. Its 4 national radio networks were mostly there, as were local stations, but 6 digital radio channels were not even a dream. Web services were nascent, and there was no ABC iView or ABC Listen, no ABC apps, no social media accounts. We've also expanded our physical footprint, while other media services have decidedly contracted. So not only does the ABC have less, but it is more efficient and provides more. Journalists here today from commercial newsrooms don't need a similar recitation of their budget declines to know what's happened. They see it in the empty chairs their colleagues once occupied and feel it in the extra deadlines they have to file every day. The fat was cut a long time ago. The knife is now scraping the bone. The tsunami I mentioned earlier has washed away a generation of journalistic talent, never to return. It's no wonder that some are saying our commercial newsrooms have reached a critical point and now face an even more rapid decline. Australia's newspapers are thinner, our newsrooms sparser, our readers and viewers and listeners more distributed with media fragmentation and commercial realignments. Everywhere you look, down, down, down the numbers go. And as our need to create national coherence and unity has increased, our capacity to build and project it has been diminished. We have to do something about this, starting at the ABC. Despite the strengths I've mentioned, real funding reductions at the ABC have taken a very real toll. Radio Australia's once great set of services, including probably the best Bahasa service in the region, have been dismantled to the detriment of our nation's soft diplomatic reach. While ABC International still does a great job with the resources it has, and the government's Indo-Pacific broadcasting strategy has enabled it to double the number of transmitters in the Pacific and increase first-run content for the region, there is much more that it can do, particularly in language. The fine Australian content we once produced in abundance for children and young people has been reduced, along with our educational programming. Content development and programming in documentaries, science, religion and ethics, drama and sporting diversity, including more recently women's sport, have also declined. Even the scope of the ABC's superb regional media offerings, which can still boast 58 locations, more than 600 staff, 800 hours of unique radio programming each and every week, and extensive coverage of regional Australian news and culture, are not what they once were. Nevertheless, we have, of course, in recent years boosted the investment in emergency broadcasting, so axiomatic to purpose at the ABC, and the Country Hour is still going strong, and I'm happy to say will celebrate its 80th year in 2025, one of the world's longest-running radio programs. I think it's number 3 or number 4 in ancient duration. And great networks like Radio National, Classic FM, the Metro Capital City Network, and a wide range of specialist audio services have been squeezed tight, to the very public dismay of their passionate audiences. To put my case most simply, the ABC needs a plan for renewal and reinvestment, and it needs it now. Extra investment will allow us to give viewers, listeners and readers what they really crave from their ABC. Extra trusted, high-quality news services with an expanded fact-checking capability across all ABC platforms. More and better children's programs. Additional educational content that complements school curricula. Stronger, diverse audio offerings. More and better documentaries, arts, drama and comedy programming. And crucially, a viable strategy to engage in better ways with younger audiences to give them a brighter future. I've mentioned the importance of our news services already, but our viewers, of course, want better content across the board. How many times have you sat watching a brilliant overseas-produced drama or documentary series on Netflix or Binge or Disney Plus and found yourself thinking, why aren't we doing this? Where are our great Australian dramas, our great historical and science documentaries, our amazing music, theatre and dance performances? Why aren't we producing and seeing more of those? For example, take documentaries. With an increase in serious television documentaries on national and international subjects of relevance, we could reinforce Australia's levels of historical and scientific literacy, two things we could use a lot more of right now. We need to challenge Australians to think widely about the world and respond with delight and wonder. We must compete in this vital space again. This is something I regard as crucial for the ABC's intellectual credibility and the fulfilment of central elements of our charter. More ambition, too, is required to refresh popular understanding of Australia's great national institutions, our parliaments, our courts, our regulators and public policy processes, and, of course, the security offered by the world's best electoral system. Australians simply don't realise how good our democratic institutions are. Informing them about this would be the most direct expression imaginable of the ABC as a proud servant of our democracy and our freedoms. No matter what the programming type, our proposed new investments will pay off with better scripts, higher production values and larger audiences, and a sense of pride and wonder in the talent of our creators and of our nation. Some say we can never compete with the US and the UK on quality programming because our population is too small to sustain it. But at 27 million people, our population is reasonably large by world standards. The tiny Scandinavian countries punch like heavyweights in the world of entertainment content development, while we, with our far larger population, are currently punching like bantamweights. I want Australia to win back its reputation for unsurpassed drama and storytelling. We can do it. We just have to believe in ourselves and invest in that belief. We've already proven it's possible from a wealth of talent in acting, directing, cinematography and all the other precious production skill sets evident with Australians across the planet. They've been superbly developed by our training institutions from Sydney and Melbourne through to Perth. Anyone watching world politics right now will know how important it is to make every citizen, regardless of their background, feel included in our democracy. Increasing numbers of people are saying the mainstream media isn't listening to them, isn't reflecting their needs, isn't including their perspectives and their stories in their national story. They are hurting. Their dissatisfaction needs to be taken more seriously. Anger can't be allowed to build up until it explodes. We need to go where these citizens are. The ABC already has the most extensive network of news and entertainment services for regional and remote Australia, as I've mentioned. Not so maybe for those in the outer suburbs of our cities, some of which are now 50 kilometres or more from where the news industry tends to be concentrated. Our recent initiative with a splendid news and programming centre at Parramatta in Sydney, which will have a final official opening next February, is going to become a beacon for such initiatives elsewhere. It is time to ensure those who live on the urban fringe can have their perspectives reflected in the news and in our public debates. With the right investment, we could establish new newsrooms in selected suburban and peri-urban population locations, new home bases from which our journalists can gather news and better reflect the views of these sometimes neglected elements of Australian community. It's an idea worth pursuing and delivering. After all, it's all about the audiences of Australia, our fellow citizens. I want to address my final remarks to our younger citizens, too few of whom are regular members of the ABC's audiences, or indeed of any broadcasting company's audience. As Tom Gleeson's scriptwriters at Hard Quiz forever remind us, the ABC's audience tends to be older than average. Some of us with less hair even than he has. This has been the case for so long now that people think it is inevitable and irreversible. But it's only inevitable if we don't do anything to reverse it. Now, I admit I am given to saying there's a new 50-year-old and 60-year-old born every minute. However, I want the ABC to go after younger viewers, listeners and readers on every platform as a vital part of our civic duty. Not because I don't appreciate the audiences we already have, we love our audiences, but as a matter of intergenerational equity. The ABC is for all our citizens, no matter what their age. And because reconnecting with the young is now an urgent democratic and cultural imperative, it is a core aspect of our being owned by all Australians. I said earlier that we need to do more than create lifeboats to prevent young Australians from drowning intellectually in the polluted tide of disinformation and misinformation swamping their screens. We must give them a rudder and engine so they can steer a course of safety and help us construct a future that is safe for democracy. This means trying new approaches to include them in our national conversations. I'd personally like to see the ABC attract and train a new generation of young journalists who understand intuitively how their contemporaries consume and think about the media and know best how to reach them with appropriate expression and perspective on their favoured and rapidly changing platforms. And I'd like to help young and old Australians alike to become more media literate and even media savvy, able to better discern truth in a world of lies. The long-term survival of the idea of the objective truth, which George Orwell once, maybe prophetically, told us is in danger of fading out of the world, rests in the hands of the young. We can do a great deal with our schools to make this happen. I started with the deluge. Let me end with what comes after, because we can help make the waters recede faster if we are smart and show purpose. Recently, writing in the Financial Times, the Columbia University historian Mark Mazower analysed what he thought was behind the re-emergence of the angry, intolerant and emotion-charged populist politics that the world thought had disappeared for good after the Second World War. Quote, he says, "At least one of the causes is clear: the retreat into information bubbles caused by the lack of a single trusted national news source, a problem much more acute in the US than elsewhere. When we are trapped in information bubbles, all we can see are enemies. All we want to do is fight, and democracy is inevitably in trouble. We are fortunate here in Australia. Our mass mainstream media is far less polarised than in many other countries. While editorial directions are disputed, usually with passion, the facts are still generally accepted by all sides. This is an important distinction. It means disinformation and misinformation are yet to completely overwhelm us. We still believe that there is something called objective truth, or at least I hope so. And one of the most important reasons for this is the one Mazower identified. Australia still has trusted sources of news. Most importantly, it still has the ABC, which is trusted by the overwhelming majority of our fellow citizens. The latest ABC corporate tracker data shows the ABC is trusted by 81% of Australians. This compares to 64% for newspapers, 61% for commercial radio, 58% for commercial television, and 26% for Facebook. As the waters of misinformation and disinformation rise, the continuing existence of the ABC as a trusted source of the truth will help save our democracy from the populist damage going on elsewhere. Yes, we have real work to do. We have standards to adhere to and objectives which must be set high. However, here is a media delivery institution which has evolved as the most reliable national delivery agent across the length and breadth of Australia, available with a range of services to deliver for Australians with an almost umbilical link to the heartbeat of the nation. This makes the ABC an unusually precious asset. We must hold on to it. And that means we must invest to keep it strong. Our people deserve it, and our democracy is certainly worth it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. We've got a wide range of questions today, and the first one is from Anna Henderson.
Anna Henderson, SBS World News and a board director here at the club. Thank you for your address. I'm also reminded of another George Orwell quote: "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. But what if the people don't want to hear it anymore because they're avoiding the news or they feel alienated? And what are you going to do about it?"
Well, I'm not sure all of those things are necessarily addressable by the ABC or by me personally. You know, there's an old saying from H.L. Mencken, the great curmudgeon of American journalism at the Baltimore Sun, when he said, "If the public don't want to come, you just can't stop them." I think that's true in news, but clearly we need to find ways to reach out that are relevant and engaging and compelling and responsive to public need. I tend to be fairly sceptical about the general commentary that says that there's news avoidance abundantly evident in society. I don't think that's true. I think there's a massive distribution of news consumption. And whilst that may be inconvenient to many single avenues of news distribution, I don't think it is reflective of a decline in news consumption generally. If anything, I think news consumption and information consumption is up.
And on the alienation task?
The alienation issue in society and the alienation issue generally is something that we have to address. I think we have to give a real sense of confidence to our people, and we need to do that in the most traditional available methodology we have, which is great storytelling and a great and engaging process of recalling from our history and from the evidence of so many in Australia's background as to what has been done and achieved. Resilience comes from knowing stuff. It comes from being able to draw on the reservoir of human experience, and we need to invest in that. It's a reservoir that needs replenishing, and we have been drawing from that reservoir very heavily without replenishing the core material, which is the intellectual and creative vigour of Australia.
Thank you. Kim, if I may, does that mean, gets to the point you were making that Anna makes about acknowledging, that anger that can build up? I mean, is that about acknowledging what has happened in Australia and the Australian economy in the last 30 or 40 years, the sorts of things that we are told have created the sort of resentment we've seen in the US, which resulted in the election outcome there?
Well, I think the Mark Mazower observation as to the absence of a single trusted source of information in America is a very significant contributing factor to America, which has experienced much greater media fragmentation than any other modern democracy. But I do think it means that the ABC has a very real responsibility to give agency to community in effective ways that actually ensure that views and attitudes, concerns and preoccupations are ventilated appropriately. Clearly, in a sensible, moderated way, and in a way that is about respectful public engagement and conversation. But there are too many in Australia that feel they have no agency.
Natasha Chrysanthou has a question.
Thank you. I'm Natasha Chrysanthou from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. I wanted to ask you about an internal ABC matter, which is the huge backlash both inside and outside the ABC following Sarah McDonald being sacked as the host of the Sydney Mornings show. Were you aware of that decision? Do you think it was the right call? And given such a large volume of complaints, do you think it should be reconsidered?
That is an interesting question from a media enterprise, given that changes in media are part of life. They're part of the programming fabric of all organisations. It's inaccurate to say that Sarah McDonald has been sacked. Her role is not being renewed. They are different conceptually. In a similar way, management has determined that it wishes to take that service in a different direction. That decision is a management decision, and I fully support our management in making relevant decisions as to the direction and content of the services that the ABC provides. So, yes, I do support that decision. I do support the notion of refreshment in the various services that the ABC offers. Read down much of the public reaction would actually say that you can never change anything ever unless the person impacted by the change is entirely in agreement with that change. And I think in a media working environment, that's a very impractical view of the world.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Jane Norman.
Hello, Kim. Thank you for your
Hi,
address
Jane.
today and welcome back to the club. I have a question about Joe Rogan, and you've sort of touched on elements of this in the US. He's obviously the world's most popular podcast host. He has 3 billion listeners. He's sort of managed to successfully capture that bro market in America. And his influence is such that in the wake of the US election, the Democrats have said that one of Kamala Harris's mistakes was that she didn't appear on his program. So I'm just wondering, if you had any observations about what's behind the Joe Rogan effect, how you believe he's managed to so successfully capture this huge market. And then for us here in Australia, you know, how would or should the ABC be going about capturing that kind of audience?
Look, I'm not sure that I'm the right person to respond to that question. I am not a consumer or enthusiast about Mr. Rogan and his work.
Shocking.
I am not one of the 3 billion, and I'm unlikely to be 3 billion and one anytime soon. I think people like Mr. Rogan prey on people's vulnerabilities. They prey on fear, they prey on anxiety, they prey on all of the elements that contribute to uncertainty in society, and they entrepreneur fantasy outcomes and conspiracy outcomes as being a normal part of social narrative. I personally find it deeply repulsive, and to think that someone has such remarkable power in the United States is something that I look at in disbelief. I'm also absolutely in dismay that this can be a source of public entertainment when it's really treating the public as plunder for purposes that are really quite malevolent.
Thank you.
Jason Katsoukas has a question.
Kim, thanks for your speech today. Jason Katsoukas from the Saturday paper. Another person with extraordinary power, Australia's richest person, Gina Rinehart, used a speech at National Mining Day, a National Mining Day event last week, to urge the coalition to have the courage to sell ABC Radio and close ABC TV, given her extraordinary wealth and apparent influence within Conservative politics and with the alternative Prime Minister, Peter Dutton. How seriously do you take Gina Rinehart as a threat to public broadcasting in Australia?
Gina Rinehart is an Australian citizen. She's offered a personal view as to action that should be taken by one side of politics. I don't believe that either side of Australian politics in the mainstream would ever consider an action of that type seriously, because, as I said before, the ABC is trusted as the most reliable source of news and information by 81% of Australians. I mean, there is deep community affection in Australia for the ABC, and there is deep reliance on the ABC across the board in the Australian community. The ABC touches the vast majority of Australians on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis. So I do not treat that particular policy objective with any particular personal seriousness.
Thank you.
Ellen Ransley.
Thank you for your speech, Ellen Ransley from The Nightly. A recent review found that ABC did add, although not deliberately, extra gunshots to footage, which gave the impression a helicopter of Australian commandos were raining bullets down on unarmed Afghan civilians below. Given all you've spoken about mis and disinformation today, did that audio editing constitute mis or disinformation, do you think? And given the significant backlash, especially among the defence and veteran community to the review's findings, how do you rebuild trust in the ABC?
Well, the ABC ran an independent review of that particular program. It identified the error that had been made in that program, and it's apologised for that error and indicated that it should never have happened.
And on rebuilding trust?
I think in running an independent review, in properly examining matters that have been brought to the ABC's attention, and in immediately apologising for what had happened and having taken the story down, that is part of the process of rebuilding trust.
Rhiannon Down.
Rhiannon Down from the Australian newspaper. Thank you for your speech. As has been touched on, there have been significant changes announced in the last 2 months with regards to ABC Radio and Radio National. Is your primary concern the need for ABC Radio to lift its ratings?
Look, I don't think the ABC should ever be in a ratings race in any part of the landscape of the ABC. The ABC should always be attentive to understanding its audiences and having appropriate measures of connection with those audiences. But the ABC is not in a simple numbers game as if it was a commercial provider of material to audiences and was being measured in the same way as commercial audiences. I think it's necessary that the ABC develops relevant measures that actually adequately describe what the objectives of different ABC programming offerings are and how the quality of the connection with intended audiences and with the audiences that are received perform.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jacob Grieber.
Thank you, Chairman. Jacob Grieber, one of the new guys at the ABC, which is probably why my colleague so bravely volunteered me to take the next question. Philip Adams, I read in the Monthly, backed you when you were just 28 to go for the managing director's job. Now that you've had your chance to sort of look back through the organisation in the chairman's role, how do you feel about taking on that job yourself?
Well, Jacob, I'll give you the first part of the response in the most irritating way for all journalists. What an interesting question. Philip Adams never backed me for the role of Managing Director of the ABC. This is part of the continuing fiction that is Philip Adams. I certainly did apply for the job of Managing Director of the ABC when I was 30, and on the rebound from the application when I was 30, I was appointed as the Chief Executive of the Australian Film Commission by Philip Adams and by Philip Adams' board at that time. I am not and would not accept being a candidate as Managing Director of the ABC now because I don't think it would pass a pub test. I know it happened once before. I know there was a transition of a chair to Managing Director. I have a very clear formed view as to the difference between governance responsibility, which involves policy and priority setting, and advocacy, I might add, as compared with execution on a day-to-day operational basis by the people who are charged with running the place. I do not seek to transfer from the governance, strategic prioritisation and advocacy role across into the operational role. Does that answer your question adequately?
I'm tempted to go for a follow-up here. But go on, Laura.
I'm going to let you do that, Jacob. Sorry.
What are you looking for in that job?
We're looking for someone who has good experience in leadership, who has good operational experience in large and complex organisations. We are aiming to get someone who has real familiarity with media, someone who has nuance in their views and the capability to appreciate the role and perspective of a national broadcaster in the 21st century, who understands the ABC Act, understands the two most critical provisions in that Act, which are Section 6 and Section 8. Section 6 being the section which describes the ABC Charter, Section 8 which describes the roles and responsibilities of the board. And we're looking for someone who has real enthusiasm, real commitment and real passion for the role.
That was everything, I think. Dan Holmes.
Thanks, Dan from the Mandarin here. I'm glad that you brought up Section 6 and 8 of your Act.
I'm probably one of your few readers in this room.
You're probably one of my few readers in the country. Thanks very much for appearing today, Kim. I actually wanted to ask you about a couple of your statutory obligations at the ABC. So, I mean, noting that you're a government corporation, you're not governed by the Public Service Act, but you do have obligations under the PGPA and a variety of other pieces of federal legislation. You also have obligations to your employers under collective bargaining, under general fair work provisions and things like that. One of your obligations is to reflect the cultural diversity of Australia. Another is to be fiscally responsible with the ABC's resources. I'm wondering how the sacking of Antoinette Lattouf accords with those responsibilities.
Another interesting question. Matters with Miss Lattouf are, of course, the subject of legal disputation currently, and we have been impeccably silent about the matter, unlike Ms Lattouf and her representatives, who seem to have been devoted to sharing on a regular basis with the media. On that matter, we are hopeful that it is capable of sensible, constructive, respectful resolution. We will continue to persist in aiming for that to be capable of respectful, constructive resolution between the ABC and Miss Lattouf. But I must correct you. Miss Lattouf was not dismissed. Miss Lattouf was on Miss Lattouf had a 5-day contract, and under that contract, the contract was brought to a close at the end of the 3rd day. So it affected the final 2 days of that contract, which of course were paid.
I think we're all aware of the circumstances of that.
No, I don't think people are, because it keeps on. No, I'm sorry.
She was sacked. So, I mean, I don't know where that leaves us.
She was not sacked. It's not possible to speak of the execution of a matter under a contract as the sacking.
Understood. But do you want to address the premise of the question, which is how does this affect the ABC's capacity to hold up its statutory obligations?
I think the ABC has a long history of being compliant with its statutory obligations under a whole welter of public policy obligations. I think the ABC is a very strong respondent to the Parliament. It is a compliant body under the PGPA and is very aware of its responsibilities under the Public Governance and Public Accountability Act. It is an organisation which has an impeccable record in audit over the course of the last few years, at least all of the years with which I am familiar, and it will continue to be an appropriate ethical respondent to all of those obligations. The ABC aims at all times to behave in a way which is consistent with good ethical practice.
Thank you.
Cameron Redden.
Mr Williams, thank you for your address. Cameron Redden, Sky News. I was struck by your reflections on Joe Rogan and his influence, particularly on younger generations, and the contest to define what is true, particularly on social media. Do you believe that the ABC's internal processes and editorial standards are fit for purpose when it comes to combating that preying on fear that you've described, or do you believe that you are losing the battle as the status quo currently is?
Well, the notion of truth being a contested issue is something that I struggle to understand. I'm very old-fashioned in relation to these things. I think facts matter, that a relevant body of facts matter. If those facts have been appropriately validated, they're not available for contestation. They are, in fact, agreed bedrock. So I have difficulty in the notion that all in life is now contestable according to opinion and according to assertion. I find that a very difficult operating assumption, that simply because I say this is so, it is therefore so, and you must accept that what I am saying makes it good. I don't accept that premise.
Thank you.
Daniel Said.
Hi, Kim. Danielle Said. Crikey. During your time as chair, you've been more vocal than previous chairs. Are you trying to reinvent the role as chair, or the ABC chair, as something more hands-on, or are you just personally more outspoken than your predecessors?
Look, I haven't reviewed commentary from my predecessors with any particular intensity. I act in a way which is consistent with the Act, which is consistent with the responsibilities in the Act. I am responsible for the agenda and the priorities in meetings of the ABC board. I am responsible for implementing those elements that are described in the Act under Section 8. Section 8 requires of the board that the ABC is operated first to the maximum efficiency to the benefit of the Australian people. Second, that the board will defend the independence and integrity of the corporation. And third, that it will ensure in the acquisition and dissemination of news and information that it is done according to commonly accepted standards of objective journalism. And then it goes into a number of other matters. I think all of my behaviour will be proven to be consistent with those principles that are defined in the Act and in the role of the board and the role of the chair. The board is also responsible for all of the relevant provisions inside the Charter.
Thank you.
Mick Stewart.
Thanks for your speech. Since you've become chair, we've seen significant and dramatic changes at the ABC. The 7 o'clock news has got a new theme. And as well as that, and because I was trained by the ABC, I can say an excellent journalist has, I think the correct formulation is, not been reappointed as 2BL's morning announcer. I was wondering, what more do you want to do to actually make us think that having you as the chair has made a change to the direction of the ABC? What would you lay out as the objectives, where your vision of where you're wanting to take the public broadcaster?
Well, pardon me for saying this, but I think I've just given a speech about those very things, and have laid out.
Make that come to pass.
Well, I think that
more sackings, more.
No, clearly, perhaps my speech was not as clear as I wanted for it to be. I said that the ABC is in need of investment, and that it needs, in order to achieve the maximum benefit in delivery to Australian audiences, it is going to need additional fuel. It is going to need to have some capacity to expand the things that it does, because they have been in decline. I pointed out that the decline over the period between 2012 and now amounted to $150 million. I pointed that the general decline in the resourcing of the ABC had seen it move from 2000 and 2001 financial year from 0.31% of federal budget outlays to where it is now, which is 0.113%. Perhaps I didn't say that clearly enough, but I am advocating for investment in the ABC. I am advocating internally that we refresh our sense of purpose and performance against it.
So give us the money and it will work.
No, I think I spoke with some vigour about the need to increase our performance with children's, with education, with documentary, in news and validation of news through fact-checking across all of the ABC's platforms. I think I spoke at some length about those things in the speech, and I'm hesitant to repeat myself for the benefit of the audience.
Could I just maybe just rephrase the question, shall we say, Kim, and just say, as you say, you've been advocating a lot and we need more money. Can you put a figure on how much more money we need? And you talked a lot about documentaries amongst those other things you've just listed. Would you see any extra funding that we're able to get be something that you'd like to see particularly funnelled into specific areas like documentary, you know, that are actually earmarked perhaps by the government for areas like documentary, local content, given the streaming issues that have been going around of late in local content. Children, how would you sell that to the government, or how are you selling it to the government?
Well, I will continue to be a vigorous advocate for the ABC and for investment in the ABC. I think governments deserve the right to have those discussions in private. I don't think it's my job to harangue the government. It's my job to speak about policy priorities and initiatives that actually will make the ABC perform better. I'm not frightened to share views as to priorities in relation to programming, and I self-confess to believing that the ABC must do a bigger, stronger job, both as to the volume and the quality of that volume for children. It must do a bigger, relevant, strong job on education, because it's utterly necessary for our future generations. I think in documentary, one could be forgiven in some parts of our work for having given documentary a moment of recess in recent years, and it needs to come back into the fore because it's so fundamental to the role and the distinctive difference of the ABC from others. In terms of the scope of work internally and the way in which the ABC operates, clearly that's up to management, but the ABC board has a vital role in agreeing the strategic priorities that are determined and the allocation of resources within the ABC.
David Spears.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Kim, for your address. David Spears from the ABC. I'm tempted to ask your favourite program on the ABC, but I won't. I'm interested in your views on social media.
That sounds like an insider's question.
Very good. You seem to have touched a little on social media and the dynamics around misinformation, disinformation, echo chambers and so on. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the legislation currently before the Parliament on banning kids under 16 from social media, but also how the ABC should engage and interact on social media. This is something we sometimes grapple with internally. What content should be there, how engaged, how involved should the ABC be on social media?
Another interesting question. I don't envy the job of the government in giving shape and strength to the action that is proposed on social media, but I think it's very strongly supported in the community, and I think the government is showing considerable fortitude in the approach that's being taken. And I think it's an approach where many in our community see that as being long overdue. And as I understand it, the opposition is in support of that process. I had an opportunity yesterday to speak to both the Minister and the Shadow Minister, and they seem to have a pretty firm alignment. Now, I know there's many a slip between cup and lip, but I think we will see action in the Parliament in the very near future, and I think that they're to be commended for responding to something on which there is genuine and legitimate community anxiety. As to the ABC's response on social media and the way in which it manages social media, I think all things dealing with social media are works in progress. We are all in a constant process of testing and learning. We're all in the process of examining what we do. I think it's important with the ABC that it not be an agent for licensing anything that is in the territory of the personally reckless, and that the ABC needs to be a considered contributor on anything that bears the brand of the ABC and is carrying the weight and purpose and sense of responsibility that the ABC must always bear.
Kim, you mentioned at the beginning of your speech it's been some years since you've been here at the Press Club, and obviously we're very pleased to have you here today, as the role of the ABC is a major part of the media story. So we're going to give you a membership card to encourage you to come back, free parking, and thank you so much for addressing us today.
Thanks, Laura.